Good morning. I'm here to respond to the What is Men's Studies discussion board. The first thing that I wanted to say is a lot of you guys tend to be saying things like, I agree with so and so said it best, and this is how I also feel. Well, what I would challenge you to do over the next several weeks as we progress through this class is to resist the urge to just agree with the other people on the discussion board, and rather than saying, yeah, I think that's the same thing, or I believe that's true too, maybe try to go into the text again or reread certain parts of the texts that were assigned for the week and see if you can't find something a little bit different or even something that might challenge what's being said, because what I've noticed is that we're tending to abstract, and I wrote all of this in our discussion board on What is Men's Studies. You'll see it's quite a lengthy post that I wrote, and I gave you several examples of what I'm talking about here, several lines of inquiry or ways of questioning the text or ways of questioning our own beliefs using the text. And so I'm hoping that you'll follow my example a little bit, and in the future, in our discussion boards, go back into the text once you've sort of read everyone's comments and see what you might add to the discussion, because our discussion's not really going to go anywhere as long as we're all sort of just saying, yeah, I agree, what she said, what he said. And so I would challenge you to resist just saying those types of things. And just for your own information, I don't consider that participation. It would be like us in class, and I would say, so what did you guys think? And then the first person would chime up and say, here's what I think, and then everybody else in class would say, aye, or yes, I agree too. And so that's not really participation. It's kind of it's kind of abstracting or simplifying the process. And so what I want to do is complicate the process and make it more complex so that we can really dive into this material. And so to sort of give you an idea of what I would consider complicating things or making things more complex, I've written down several of the words that I read when I was looking through Bryce Tracer's article about academic Viagra. And this article was a little bit more difficult than the other readings that you'll read for this semester. Most of the articles that we'll read for this semester will be a little bit easier to get through. They won't have big, huge words that you've probably never even heard of. But even so, as a student in this class, you should really strive to understand what he's trying to say, and so that's what I'm here to do today, is help you a little bit. And the first place that I wanted to go is his repeated use of the word masculinities, the plural masculinities. And I kind of wanted to ask you guys a question about that and what you think about that, because in the past, I'm sure, or I'm not sure, but I would imagine that you've never heard a word like femininities, plural, or masculinities, plural. We usually think of femininity in one very specific way, and we think of masculinity in one very specific way. And to sort of drive home that point, I posted a link to an organization called Promise Keepers. And Promise Keepers is a Protestant organization. Tracer mentions it in his article. A Protestant organization that pushes for a normative masculinity, and that's another of the terms that I wrote down from Tracer's article. Normative masculinity means a masculinity that a certain group or a select group or a number of groups in concert are trying to make the norm or to make normal. And so what happens when someone or when a group of people tries to make one thing normal is that they inadvertently or on purpose make other things abnormal. And we've seen this all the way through history. If back in history, if a woman did what she was quote supposed to do and stayed at home and take care of the children and maintained the house, then she was quite the typical woman. Nobody had any problems with what she did. She was left alone, basically, to live her life. But if a woman was doing something a little bit different, she stepped outside of that normative femininity, and then people started to question her. And we can look at as one really good example at the Salem witch trials, right? Women who were practicing witchcraft, and I'm putting that in quotes too, because they were probably just acting outside of the feminine norm that had been established. But women who were doing things outside of that norm were called witches, and they were burnt, or they were put in prison, or they were harassed their entire lives because they failed to assimilate to that normative femininity. Well, what that shows us here, and here I go with my fingers at the camera again, what that shows us here is that you've got a normative femininity, and then you've got everything that's outside of that normative femininity. So there are your femininities, two of them at least, and then all of the ones in between. Well, Tracer points out that the notion of masculinities, several different kinds of masculinity. And so I want you guys to be thinking about that as we go through the next couple of weeks, these pluralized notions of femininities and masculinities, because that sort of suggests that there's not just one, that there are multiple and myriad ways to be masculine and be feminine, and that's going to branch us right into a conversation about masculinity that we find outside of men, like women who have masculine tendencies, or transgendered people who have masculine tendencies. And it's also going to allow us to talk about men who have feminine characteristics and men who practice femininities. And so that's a conversation we'll get into over the next couple of weeks, and it gets us to two other points that Traister makes, and one of them is called gender fluidity, and the other is called gender as performative. And so those kind of go together. The first one I'm going to talk about is gender fluidity. And you know the word fluid, it means it's kind of rolls like the ocean. There's no real set boundaries. You can kind of cross over from one to the other. And that's what the word fluid means. If a dancer moves and her body moves really gracefully, that's a fluidity that she has. Well, we take that same sort of metaphor of the dancer's fluid body and we put it inside of gender, and we see that instead of having these strict male over here and female over here and never the twain shall meet, there's sort of a fluidity that goes on in through here. And people can wander from one side to the other and practice on certain days or in certain events a more masculine demeanor, and on certain days or certain events a more feminine demeanor. And so that's what he means by gender fluidity. The idea that gender is not static, gender is not set, that in fact people are constantly wandering back and forth between the extreme poles of masculine and feminine to sort of occupy these middle spaces more constantly. In other words, we're never really just one or the other. We sort of merge the two depending on what the situation calls for. And that gets at the idea of gender as performative. The word performative just means an act or a way of being or a way of putting yourself out there. And we're all performing all the time. My little hand gestures that I'm always doing, that's a performance. My brain has to actively say, now move your hand, because for some reason I think that if I move my hand just the right way, my meaning will come across more clearly. And that's how gender also operates. We do specific things so that the meaning of our gender will come across more clearly. So let me give you some examples of gender performance. For females or for women, one very typical or normative performance that women engage in is leg crossing. So we were taught as young girls to cross our legs at the ankle or to cross our legs at the knee. And all of these are performances that scream, I am a normal female. I am fitting into feminine normativity, right? And then for males, it's kind of opposite. When a male crosses his legs at the knee or at the ankle, we sort of look at him and say, well, he's practicing a femininity or a feminine gesture. And so normative masculinity would dictate that a man doesn't cross his legs. So when a man doesn't cross his legs, or when he spreads his leg apart and really claims the space that he's in, we assume that he is a normative masculine, that he's practicing normative masculinity. And so that's kind of an interesting concept, these two ideas of gender fluidity and gender as performance. And the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was this big phrase that I found in his article called, and he said, the hegemonic constructions of normative masculinity. And so I encourage you to look up the word hegemony, H-E-G-E-M-O-N-Y, hegemony, and it basically talks about this sort of pervasive and subtle influence that all people in the world have and that they feel, and that this sort of influence dictates the way that we act, and it usually dictates the way that we act by negatively influencing us if we are not doing what we're supposed to be doing. So I know that I didn't say that right, so let me try it again. Hegemonic constructions of normative masculinity are when, let's take, for example, the guys in the class. When you do something that is not normative and not normative masculine, like when you sit with your legs crossed, there might be a little bit of pressure from other people for you to uncross your legs and sit like a man. Well, that's hegemonic constructions of normative masculinity. It's that pressure that you feel to act in a very certain way because of your ascribed gender. And so as we go through the semester, and especially in your final projects, you're going to get to experiment with these sort of normative constructions and these hegemonic constructions. But I'll get that out to you guys as soon as possible. I'm running out of time, so I might have to post just one more video to talk about masculinity, but read my comment in depth so that we can sort of get these discussion boards pushing toward more invigorating discussion. See you guys later.